All right, Michael over here. I'm going to get into uh, two of the pieces today that you have as options for the rhetorical analysis. And I kind of wanted to walk you through these a little bit so that you would have a little bit of a grounding and maybe think about how to approach these. So I want to start with JFK's inaugural address. And if you haven't watched the video or read it, I would suggest that you go ahead and do that and then come back to this. There are any spoilers per se, but I would prefer that you read it or watch it and try and figure out what strategies Kennedy is using before you watch or listen to this video lecture. So I just want to start with kind of the soapstone business. And I know in a previous video, I sort of talked about, okay, so the speaker here is not just John F. Kennedy as a person, it's all of the things that go along with who he was at the time. JFK being the newly elected president, it being right in the middle of this sort of beginning of the Cold War, all of these tensions going on around the world, and that really helps us understand what he's addressing, who he's addressing, and why. We also have the occasion, which is, again, tied into that, which is this is his inauguration, and so he's taking this opportunity to sort of set the tone of his presidency, right? His priorities as far as, peace and cooperation and whatnot. The audience is tricky because here again, I think most people would have a tendency to either say he's speaking for everyone, which, as I've mentioned, is a mistake, and we're never speaking for everyone. We might send out a message that is accessible to everyone, but we're not really speaking to everyone. So, and I think the other problem is to say that he's speaking just to the American people, which we know he's not because he says, let every nation know. He says, to these different groups of people, to those new states, to those people in the Hudson villages, to our sister republics, to that World Assembly of Sovereign States, the UN. So he actually is speaking to a lot of different people, but in turn, his primary audience is still the American people, right? The people that hold his values. And this is important because he can fall back on certain things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or unity, or peace as themes that we have in common as American citizens. So the purpose, and again, I've kind of talked about this before just a minute ago, and it shows you sort of how interconnected all these things are. His purpose is really to set the tone of where he's coming at, or where he's coming from, and how he's going to address the leadership of the United States. Now, in terms of tone, we've got a very positive, patriotic, but also, dare I say, aggressive. It's sort of like, don't push us or we will fight back, but we don't want to, right? So let's just start with a couple of basic techniques that Kennedy uses that he uses really, really well. So the first one is word choice. So if we look even at the first line, we observe today not a victory of a party, but a celebration of freedom. So again, celebration of freedom is likely to draw in his audience and make us think, yeah, we're celebrating our freedom and what it means to be Americans. And he says that it's an end as well as a beginning, a renewal as well as a change. Of course, he's speaking here in terms of him being the new president, right? A little bit further down in the next sort of paragraph, he says, the world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. So again, think about this, mortal hands. He's acknowledging that we are mortal, that we are not immortal, and we have to sort of take, our reality, right? The power to abolish human poverty. So abolish is a very strong word. He doesn't say get rid of or end, but abolish. And all forms of human life. So again, I think here what he's talking about is that cooperation, and what a great way to juxtapose it. We can either make everything really, really great, or we can destroy everything, and it's in our hands, and we have to be aware of our responsibilities and the power of that. He also brings in religion, right? The hand of God. And he does this a couple times. He talks about the Isaiah in here somewhere, which you'll have to forgive me, I'm not up on my Bible references. I also, the trumpet call, which I think is also part of this sort of biblical allusion. In here as well, he talks specifically to the American people to get them sort of fired up. He says, "We dare not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth from this time and place as friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generations of America, us, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by hard and bitter peace, and proud of our ancient heritage." Here he's saying, we know what we stand for, right? And he's sort of bringing in his audience. This is a direct address to his audience to get them fired up with that pathos, right? That passionate appeal, and kind of building on his ethos or credibility because, right, Kennedy was born in that century, in the 20th century, and he was a veteran. He had been at war. In fact, he was seen by many as a war hero. So he's bringing himself into this as well and embracing his ethos while also getting other people fired up about it. Now let's look a little bit at repetition. We get this to those new states, to those people, to our sister republics, to that world assembly. This helps contextualize it, and for us to know who he's talking to, it's very, very clear, and that repetition also keeps the pacing of things moving forward. We're not going to get lost as the reader or listener in what he has to say or who he's talking about or to, right? He does it again later on. He says, let both sides explore, let both sides for the first time, let both sides seek to invoke, let both sides unite and heed. Right? Again, this sort of repetition. And then, again, this sort of passionate appeal or playing on our emotions, again, with a little bit of word choice and a little bit of call to actions. In your hands, he says, my fellow citizens, more than in mine, right? So he's actually saying, like, I'm the president, but it's not just up to me, it's up to you, right? Will rest the final success of failure of our course. Since this country was founded, each generation of Americans has been summoned, again, there's a specific word choice, to give testimony, biblical reference, to its national loyalty, passion, right? Digging into our patriotism. The graves of young Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe. So again, how else can I drive home if I'm Kennedy? Our responsibility then to say, hey, all these people have died in conflicts around the globe, and we kind of owe it to them to do the right thing, right? And be proud of them and proud of that, right? And then, again, in the last bit here, we get freedom and righteousness, right? And more word choice, forging alliances, and then the last little bit, again, we get perhaps the most famous lines of this speech and repetition. So, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, again, broadening out here audience, now he's addressing, I guess I have to eat my own words, he is kind of addressing everybody. Ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you, with good conscience our only sure reward, with history as the final judge of our deeds. Let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own. So again, ending with that religious appeal, which again, Kennedy is aware that at the time, a good percentage of America, or maybe not percentage, but at least in identity, was Christian, whether or not that was true or just what was espoused in the media. So what we've done there is actually to break it down. And the last question is to ask, was he successful? Well, it's, I don't know, I'm not a math major. 60, 70 years later, we're still reading this speech and we're still looking at how well it works. I guess it's closer to 50, whatever. It stands the test of time and is probably one of the most well-known speeches of Kennedy's, other than the Ich bin ein Berliner, which is for different reasons. It's effective because it rallied people together. It firmly established his point of view and what his agenda was and what he wanted to accomplish, and it did set the tone for his presidency. Okay, so I want to turn our attention to another speech, this one even 100 years older. So again, as we look at Frederick Douglass's speech, The Hypocrisy of American Slavery, we have to realize that this has lasted even longer. Now, perhaps not as famous as far as like a little soundbite that people could pull out of it or maybe identify that Douglass was the one that said some of these things. But we have to play the same game with Soapstone. Who's the speaker? Frederick Douglass. Why is that important? Well, he was born a slave in Maryland, and he essentially became one of the most prominent black leaders of the United States at the time. He was largely self-educated. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is something read in high schools to this day. He was intelligent and driven and eloquent, right? And so here, what we've got is who he is. He is a black man in 1850s America where slavery is still present. Again, this is pre-Civil War. And he's talking about his experience as a black man on the 4th of July, right? The day when America celebrates its independence and national identity. So there we have speaker and occasion. We have audience. He is clearly speaking to white Americans. He is not speaking to African Americans again because this is a time period when most African Americans would have been slaves or servants. He's not talking to women, probably because women were maybe not even invited to this, right? Again, this is still pre-suffrage. He's got a very specific audience. So, and then we have to go to purpose, right? So purpose is he wants to point out how hypocritical it is to sort of have him there and ask him to celebrate with them. So Audre Lorde's 4th of July personal narrative comes to mind here. It's a similar sort of idea. Okay, so again, if you haven't read The Hypocrisy of American Slavery yet, I would pause the video, go read it, and then come back. I think you'll get more out of it if you try to sort of pick these apart on your own. So let's look at the very, very first line. This is sort of fascinating to me. So look at how he structures this, and this is very intentional. Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? First, direct address to fellow citizens. Second, this aside asking for their forgiveness, followed by the rhetorical question. Now, I don't think that that's by any means accidental or incidental. And so he starts out by asking, why am I here? Why did you ask me to come and speak on this occasion, right? And he starts what will be a continuing theme through this, which is the religious component, right? He says, and am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offerings to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Again, audience, right? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to those questions. Again, at no point really does he ignore this separation. He's very, very aware of, you asked me or they asked him as a black man to come and speak to a white audience. He's very aware that he's not part of this group, and that's the main contention that he has, is that they're bringing him in to speak, but he's rightly suspicious as to why. And he goes into this, again, sort of speech with this behind him, thinking about this strange hypocrisy. And he brings it up again and again, as well as he does the religious component, right? So he says, a little bit further down after what I just read, who's so stolid and selfish that would not give his voice to swell the hallelujahs of a nation's jubilee when the chains of servitude had been torn from his limb? I am not that man. In a case like that, the dumb might eloquently speak, and the lame man leap as an hart. So again, he's again pointing out, why am I here, right? And bringing in this religious component with some things like hallelujahs. And now he's working more as well with his ethos, his credibility, and who he is, right? And he continues this. This is the core of this, is specifically Fredrick Douglass and his experience. He says, I say it with a sad sense of disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Right? Now, pale there, maybe isn't intentional as a double meaning, but in this context, my guess is it's also the idea of beyond the pale, which is actually beyond the outer boundaries, right? So he's not within the boundaries of this. And he talks about, again, the foundations of the American Republic, at least ideally, right? Independence, justice, liberty, prosperity. And he says that those things are bequeathed or given or inherited to your fathers, shared by you, but not by me, again, separated. The sunlight, again, word choice, that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. So all the great stuff that you've had has not been so great for me. And again, he's speaking as a member of a very specific population. You may rejoice, I must mourn. Right? Now it's interesting because even though he's pointing out the difference between his audience and himself, he's also aware that they're fellow citizens because he is a citizen of the United States. So that is something that they have in common, right? He says, fellow citizens, so we get that repetition here. Above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wails of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilant shouts that reach them. You guys are shouting in freedom, and yet who is not free? The slaves, right? So again, this hypocrisy. We're here to celebrate freedom, but there are a lot of people that aren't free. And again, we get some religious component, right? To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme would be treason, word choice, most scandalous and shocking, and would make me reproached before God and the world. My subject, then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from a slave's point of view. Again, remember, Douglass, ethos, he was a slave. He's a freed slave, but it was not easy. It's not like, you can look into his biography, but more word choice here too, hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. That's pretty damning, right? In fact, in this next part, and I'm going to go ahead and read the whole part out because I think this is an amazing piece of writing here just to look at as a piece of writing, if not to look at the rhetorical analysis. He says, Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, a great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate, I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just. That is pretty amazing. Not only is it direct and to the point, the language and the wording is powerful, the emotion behind it is powerful. He also has this nice sentence structure with in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered. So we get that repetition again, right? And bringing in sin and religion again. He's also here addressing the audience, and it's a pretty clever rhetorical strategy to say, if you don't agree with me, then you are basically no better than a slaveholder. Now, if he's speaking to free white men who want to abolish this, and he's speaking about freeing the slaves on the day that Americans celebrate freedom, that is a perfect opportunity, right? He goes on, right, to talk about the hypocrisy and irony of why we even had to argue that black people deserved rights anyway. And he does this kind of starting partway through, and he carries it on for quite a while. He says, the manhood of the slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding under severe fines and penalties the teaching of the slave to read and write. So if you have to have a law there, you have to sort of count them as men, right? He says, when you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of a slave. So he's sort of pointing out, like, it's actually silly to have these arguments. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty? Again, word choice, rhetorical question. That he is the rightful owner of his own body. You already declared it. So again, he's also pointing out here the logical fallacy in the argument for keeping slaves, right? He goes on and basically takes apart the counter argument or the argument against him. And he does something similar to Kennedy here towards the end, which is this sort of call to action. Here, right towards the end, he says, at a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. Again, this list, right? For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be denounced. So again, playing on emotions, playing on this sort of what is a happy occasion for all the white people is not by any means a happy occasion for the black people, especially those that are still slaves, and would be bittersweet for somebody like Fredrick Douglass, who is a freed slave, knowing that he escaped something brutal, right? So, again, I think if you look at these two, they're both excellent speeches and things in which the authors have used a whole host of rhetorical strategies in order to prove their points. They've used word choice, they've used allusion, they're clearly aware of their audience, they're clearly aware of who they are as a speaker, and again, those two are always connected. Speaker and audience are always connected. And all of those things are leveraged to great advantage. Is Frederick Douglass's piece powerful? I would contend that yes, it is. It hits all the right points. I can't even read it today without feeling like his passion and anger and frustration. Um, and it's, again, it's something that is well over 150 years old.